Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. In the 10 years to 2011, the number of people in this country who defined themselves as Christian dropped from 72% to 59%. Judged by church-going attendance, we are one of the most secular countries on the planet. And yet in a poll conducted for a Christian think tank, most people do believe in spiritual forces. That's the background for today's discussion, when I want to ask an apparently very simple question, but one appropriate for the time of year. If we are not a nation of great formal religious believers, why is it that religious poetry and religious music seem to matter more than ever? For me, it's a personal question, because since my stroke, I found myself, though I am not religious, turning to the poetry of Christian writers such as T.S. Eliot, Wendell Berry, and in particular, George Herbert. And the music I'm playing constantly is Bach cantatas. To talk about this, we have the Reverend John Drury, who has written a splendid new biography of George Herbert. He's joined by our greatest composer of religious music, Sir John Tavener, known for works such as The Protecting Veil and Song for Athene. Sir John nearly died several years ago and found the experience of the possibility of sudden death changed his outlook to music and faith. And with them, the writer whose ultra-religious evangelical upbringing in Lancashire has become the stuff of legend, and whose rebellion against it helped fuel a series of stunning novels and a heartbreaking memoir, Jeanette, Winterson. It's a conversation I think is going to shoot all over the place, but I'd like to start, if I may, John Drury, by just setting Herbert in context. This is really England between the great Shakespearean age and the coming revolutionary religious wars.
Yes, Herbert was lucky in the time in which he lived. James I, the most intelligent monarch, I should think, that has sat upon the throne.
He doesn't often get a good press. Interesting to hear you saying that.
Well, he wrote huge Latin works. I don't think they're particularly worth reading, but in their time they were very, very notable. And he promoted intelligent people wherever he could. Unfortunately, he was besotted with the Duke of Buckingham, and that's something which Herbert eventually confronted and which upset him a good deal. The oration that he gave when Buckingham came back from Spain, having made a complete fool of himself with Prince Charles, was a piece of really outrageous flattery and special pleading, after which his academic career as orator, as a Cambridge John, petered out. Something happened. I guess something like, do I want to do this all my life? And
you make it clear in your book that this was an ambitious, worldly man. Yes. For a lot of his life. He tried quite hard to make a success of it.
He did, indeed. To get the oratorship, he became practically obsessive and manic. He was writing letters all over the place, and in a tremendous state. He wanted it really badly. Of course, that reflects on another advantage that he had, which was for a very intelligent boy to be trained in language, his own and Latin.
And the Cambridge education is a lot about dialogue and learning how to respond to other arguments.
Yes, I think that's very important. Yes, an examination was something where you argued with somebody else, viva voce. It wasn't writing, it was speaking. As well as you've mentioned, he was there in the time of Shakespeare and Donne. He was also in the great age for English music, with Doland, Gibbons.
His mother was clearly a remarkable woman, a friend of John Donne's, and so he was brought up in a highly cultured, quite sophisticated environment.
Yes, he was. It was in many ways a stroke of luck, because his father died and they moved from Montgomery, which was the Wild West, and his father's family were tough and sort of sheriffs in a soap opera, really, and they moved to near Shrewsbury, where his mother had her house, his widowed mother. Philip Sidney had stayed with them at, just south of Shrewsbury when he was a boy at the school there, and eventually to London and to Cambridge.
And then, of course, he has his great crisis, and he decides to become a country parson,
yes,
and almost search for obscurity and the inner life. And I suppose the most extraordinary thing about these poems is that they were never intended originally to be published. They weren't for a public. They were between him and God. They're more like prayers in some respects than conventional poems.
They're a sort of diary, I think. I mean, religion is very bewildering. The Christian religion can be very, very bewildering in its demands and notions and everything. And it was something he wrote to sort out himself in the presence of God. So, as you say, they're like prayers.
And he has this remarkably intimate tone, and I think we need to hear one at this point. You start off with the Love 3, I think, at the beginning of your book, which is one of the most...
That's an extraordinary one. It's difficult to read, but I better have the text.
I think you better have a go.
Yes, he always knew, in a way, that he would never do better than this, and yet he went on writing. It's not the last poem he wrote by any means, but it always at last in his collection. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says Love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat.
It's a lovely poem, and I think a lot of people will notice first how pure and simple the language is, as if the kind of language of Shakespeare had been rinsed and rinsed and rinsed until a small number of pebbles come out at the end. Yes,
it is, but if you examine it, it's wonderful in its construction. The way it's sort of onomatopoeic and very near to music. My soul drew back. These are sort of long stress things. And then love took my hand. Love has fewer words, but they're sprightly. And the I has more to say.
And he's addressing God almost like a lover. It's a very intimate conversation going on.
Yes, I mean, just imagine how it would be impoverished if it started, God bade me welcome. Actually, in the end, it's love that matters. There's a remarkable poem, Discipline. And you see that title and you think, oh gosh, I know what it's going to be, how we've got to behave. Not at all. It's how God ought to behave. He doesn't behave rightly. He lashes out, put away thy wrath, put away thy rod, it starts. And in the middle of it, there's a remarkable episode where Cupid, the little god of love, loves a man of war. Love can shoot and hit from far, and he hits God, who falls to earth like a shot pheasant. And Herbert says, if love could do that to you, don't you think you might use it on me rather than all this punishment? Jeanette, I noticed on your website you have one of Herbert's poems quoted among your favourite poems. You've got long lists of poems there. What is it about Herbert, and what is it about this religious form of writing that appeals, do you think, in the modern age so much?
It's the vexed question of how the soul can adapt to a world that's always in flux and in change and in movement. Not because the soul, whatever we mean by that, is fixed, but because it is a part of us that I think even the most secular person can understand. We know what we mean when we say somebody's got soul. We know what we mean when we say things are soulless. We talk about modern life in that way very often. And yet, as religion seems to retreat from the active lives of many people and seems to have so little to say, we're left with this rather lonely part of ourselves, which is the soul, which has no company. So what do? You look for somewhere naturally enough where you can find company for your soul, and also something that takes your soul seriously and accepts that you've got one. It's really a very simple question, that life has an inside as well as an outside, and that everything now is predicated to the outside. And do you think that Herbert could only do that because he had such a quiet but relentless internal life? He had the silence and the relative obscurity to have this constant conversation about what was going on inside him. Yes, I mean, because it was a different world. I mean, it's interesting when you read about people like Herbert wrestling with interruptions. It's rather like Coleridge and the Man from Porlock, and you think, blimey, if they'd had emails, how would they ever have got anything done? Thing going every 5 minutes. But it's fascinating to me that it seems that always part of the human condition to be wrestling with this question, both of the outer world and of the inner world, of ambition and solitude, about how you manage and have status and company, and how you also have a life which is real to you? And that's what Herbert is so good at elucidating for us now. How do we have a life that's real to us?
Sir John, you've set 3 of Herbert's poems as hymns, and they're going to be heard in this country, I think, early next year for the first time. What is it about Herbert that's special?
Well, I think it's their incredible musicality, because as John was saying, it was, he was a musician and he was a composer. And I think poetry immediately opens up a sound world for me, and particularly in George Herbert. But because I think he was so musical, one hears the cadences, one feels. There's almost no poem by Herbert that I couldn't look at and imagine music. I'm very involved with Dante at the moment, and I think you could say that both poets, Dante said of himself, tutti I miei pensieri parlano d'amore, all my thoughts speak of love, and I think you could say the same about George Herbert. But you don't need the same encyclopedic knowledge to read George Herbert that you do to read Dante.
Indeed,
Yes.
indeed. And John Drury, he was himself a keen amateur musician. There's a lovely story you tell in the book about him arriving splashed with mud at one of his rehearsal practices.
Yes, it's a very nice story. It comes from Walton, who can be suspect, but this has the ring of truth, because Herbert was a very natty dresser, and when he was an undergraduate he was a bit of a fogey and rather aloof. When he became a country parson, he was actually very nicely placed, with Salisbury Cathedral 1 mile in one way, Wilton House, the great Herbert House, on the other way. Anyhow, he was walking from Bemerton in the middle to Salisbury, a muddy path along the little river Nadder, and there was a man with a cart, and the cart had got into the ditch, and the man was distressed. So Herbert helped the man get the horse back into harness and the man in place, and on they went. He arrived, however, at a private music making after evensong. He would go to somebody's house and they would play Dowland or something, and his own work. And they were very shocked to see him very, very muddy. This was unprecedented. So he told them what had happened, and they reproached him and said, not for you to do that kind of thing.
Your quality.
Exactly, the word. And he said that he didn't regret it, and that it would be music to him at midnight.
Which is where your title comes from, Music
Yes.
at Midnight, indeed.
Insomnia, remedy for insomnia.
Jeanette, can we talk a little bit about the language? Because one of the points you make in your memoir is the extreme importance in your upbringing of having the King James Bible still there as the sort of storehouse of language, which then connected you and anyone else brought up with that particular book to the world of Shakespeare and the world of Donne and the world of Herbert.
People who try to do good in the world often end up making a terrible mess, and I think one of the messes was cutting off ordinary working class men and women from the King James Bible under the mistaken assumption they wouldn't be able to understand it, so you had to have endless revisions and simplify the language. When I was growing up in Lancashire in the 1960s, lots of working men went to working men's lectures, and they often studied Shakespeare. They had no difficulty understanding Shakespeare, even though they didn't read anything else, because they heard the King James Bible and always had. And an ear for those cadences and those rhythms from when you were very young stays with you. It becomes part of your own speech patterns, and therefore connects you to 400 years of language, instead of suddenly finding yourself marooned from 400 years of language. So the idea that things are difficult only happens if we become cut off from language. So I think it's all about keeping continuity and not endlessly worrying that people won't understand. It's always overeducated people who want to make people have no education, have no access to it. It's astonishing.
Yes. And so, John, there is a wider point here as well, which relates to music, which you do need a certain amount of education. You need a tuned ear to understand some of the religious references in your music, and a lot of people simply don't have it anymore. You're all working cut off from the tradition which has lasted for centuries.
That's true, and there's a huge lost knowledge, a sort of esoteric knowledge, which people in the Middle Ages were aware of. Educated people at the time of Dante. But I think that it communicates at another level. I don't think you actually have to have that knowledge. I think a person can read Dante, can read Herbert without having the religious gnosis, as it were, I think that it I think Herbert, for a start, communicates rather like a Schubert song. It's sublime, it's exquisitely formed, and you can appreciate it from that point of view.
Mm.
It's about what we get used to hearing and seeing, isn't it? I mean, my friend the cellist, Natalie Klein, who loves modern music of all kinds and often does cross-platform work, just says, the thing is, if you're just listening, if you're going to just listen to contemporary music or pop music all of the time, it's very difficult to reattune your ear. And so things appear to be harder than they are, simply because they're unfamiliar. And we're always made nervous by what's unfamiliar. And I think it's the same with the poetry. You only have to read the poetry out loud, which is the only way to read poetry. You know, if you find a poem difficult, you just read it out loud and it begins to make sense. And if we allowed people that possibility, they would very quickly find that their ear and their brain worked again with all those rhythms, I think, whether it's music or whether it's language. And you would expand the self instead of narrowing the self.
And you were brought up in this Pentecostal background where presumably people were reading out loud the whole time, but it's quite unusual.
Well, again, it was useful because it was an oral tradition, not a literary tradition, because these were working class people. So the testimony and the spoken word were very important, and that sharing that conversation, which in its own way was the kind of examination that you're talking about, that people learned by dialogue and exchange, and it was spoken. And that's why in the North you still have a more lively vernacular, I think. It's not even now entirely watered down and homogenised by television and popular culture. There are still those exciting and exuberant pockets of language which just poke out of the norm, and that's what English has always been so good at, allowing people to speak in their own tongue, but with eloquence and with dignity.
John Drury, I'd like to turn now to the extraordinary luck, really, that we have Herbert's poems at all, because he didn't intend them ever to be published in his lifetime, and he left them, didn't he, to a close friend.
Yes, he had kept them very carefully, and he'd worked on them a lot and revised them. A couple of them were written pretty certainly for a rather annoying man who kept bothering him about whether he should be a clergyman, or they didn't want him to be a clergyman, Herbert and his circle, because he was a good businessman. A couple addressed to him because he was a worrier. But on the whole, yes, he kept them, he worked on them, and when he was dying, he gave them to a clergyman called Duncan, who had come over from Little Gidding, that famous place.
Which was a kind of religious retreat come community.
It was sort of basically a family with a matriarch and her son, Nicholas, who ran it. So he sent the poems to Ferrer at Little Gidding. He could trust him, and they got there. And Herbert had sent a message with the poems saying, if you think these poems will help anybody, any poor
interesting way of putting it. Yes.
Yeah, if they could be of practical use, as it were, in people's lives, let them be published. If not, you can burn them. And Ferrer read them and wept, really. He hadn't seen before this quality, so he got them straight to Cambridge. He had a scriptorium in the house where his nieces and the women of the house copied out commentaries, manuscripts and so on. He had it copied out straight away, sent it to Cambridge, and it was printed within the year of Herbert's death and went through about 7 editions in as many years. It caught on instantly because I think of its truthfulness and what Jeanette has been saying, that it spoke to that part of ourselves which perhaps hasn't been spoken to before quite like this, but spoke so recognisably in the right language about the things that happen to us all.
And hugely popular, but then drops out of popularity as well, quite dramatically. Like Sir John, a lot of music drops out as well. There's a very interesting period from the kind of late 18th century onwards when there seems to be a kind of decision by lots of people to turn their backs on the music and the poetry of the Jacobean period in particular.
I think people got very excited about the Enlightenment. They got very excited about new things that were happening, and somehow the great period of religious music dropped out. But I think it's quite telling that it has come back, and love of religious poetry and love of religious music has come back. That makes, although one says what a terrible century it is, according to Hindu metaphysics, we're at the end of the Kali Yuga. And during this period, there is supposed to be a kind of recovery of the sacred in a new form.
That's very interesting. So we're turning our backs, or a lot of people are, on the big brassy sounds of the romantic composers,
Yes,
and the sort of
yes.
slightly overblown, overwrought,
yes.
going back to a simpler kind of music.
Yeah.
And again, it's going back to what Jeanette was saying about the need for a sort of the inner self to be.
Absolutely. And everybody has that inner self.
And in the world of kind of serious or classical music, do you think there's a clear distinction between religious music or non-religious music?
I think there is a very spiritual music and a non-spiritual music. And then there's a kind of ecclesiastical music and a spiritual music, and I think they're all slightly different. But I think it's the age where religions must come together in some kind of way, and therefore there should be a spirituality that comes out of that.
There's a new book out about the seasons and makes the point that a lot of the religious world, the poem, poetry, and certainly the music was based around a very clear notion of a series of seasonal festivals which everybody understood, and they have fallen away, apart from Christmas, I suppose, and Easter up to a point. But Jeanette, when you were growing up, was there still a sort of sense of the sacred year, as it were, moving through the festivals, or had it gone already?
No, it hadn't gone, and I think it's important. And again, it's the sort of thing that anchors you very practically in something larger than yourself, in a spiritual life which you can touch and feel, which isn't just invisible or airy-fairy. And I love the fact that here's Herbert wondering if his poems will be of any use to anybody. And it reminds me of Seamus Heaney saying that poetry should be strong enough to help. It's this idea of the thing being practical, above all, and that's what we're talking about now, isn't it? We're trying to talk about a way of how you live with some brightness in your life.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, the lack of practicality was always a nightmare for Herbert. His most anxious poem was headed Employment. What should I be doing? So there certainly was a satisfaction in those last years that he was among country people, mending their quarrels, attending to their diseases and so on.
And he loved to go and bless the crops, didn't he, when he was
did.
a country parson?
Yes, that was an old-fashioned custom.
Lovely thing to do.
He liked old customs.
Yes, I mean, I do that in my garden. I don't know if it works, but it feels. I got a good crop of apples this year.
A word to the marrows. Yeah.
He was happy as a country person. I mean, he enjoyed.
He does seem to have been, and
yeah.
of course he got an excellent wife. There are two opinions about
Always
her.
helps.
Walton says she was very platonic and, nothing ever happened, don't worry. Whereas Aubrey, who knew the family, said she was a bonar robar. She was good stuff and ingenious. She was
He had
clever.
children or not?
No, he had nieces who came and lived with them very happily.
And he was very nice to the nieces and believed in women's education at the time when many
He
people
absolutely
didn't.
did. Yes.
Good old Herbert. Right, I want to move on and talk a little bit about Sir John's music now, because the parallel, of course, is that you've been making religious-themed music or spiritual music all your life, Sir John, and you started as a Presbyterian, you became a Roman Catholic, you then converted to the Orthodox Church. I'm just wondering, in those periods of different spiritual life for you, did that reflect itself in radically different music?
Yes, but I think, now, since I've been ill, like you, I've been looking back on my life a lot, and the Presbyterian origins are actually quite strong in me, because I knew the most wonderful pastor who used to break down in Easter sermons. I mean, his spirituality was so naked. I remember him saying, life is a creeping tragedy, that's why I must be cheerful. I'll never, ever forget that. That's an extraordinary...
That's a very Presbyterian thing to say.
But that's why I must be cheerful. That is so
Yes,
extraordinary.
you must be cheerful.
In a way, I love all the various traditions, and I love aspects of the Roman Catholicism, Orthodoxy, which I consider myself to still be, and then a more universalist phase, where I've set the 99 names in Arabic according to Islam. That was a wonderful experience, and it's the sound of language. The same with Herbert. When I heard the Arabic words for God, I walked round the garden and thought about them and said them to myself. Then suddenly the music appeared. It was extraordinary. So it is the sound of Herbert, the sound of Dante, the sound of the Arabic language, the sound of Sanskrit.
Well, we've heard the sound of Herbert. I think we should hear the sound of Sir John Tavener a little bit, as a small moment from The Protecting Veil. Those were the fingers of Stephen Isserlis there, playing the cello. Beautiful. So, John, you mentioned your near-death experience recently, and I'm just wondering what effect that had on your worldview and your making of music.
Well, I mean, temporarily it seemed to shut everything down. I couldn't sense the idea of God anymore. I couldn't sense any music. Everything vanished. Maybe because I was so physically weak, and I'd spent 6 months in intensive care, and I had the heart had stopped 4 times. I was in such a weak state. I mean, maybe because of that, I was unable to feel anything. I wasn't exactly depressed. I just had no sense of music, no sense of that other life that had enriched me, because they go, music and believing in God has always gone together. And it was only after being nursed by my wife back into some state of health that the music and a different kind of faith started to come back.
Was there a particular moment, or was it a process over days and weeks?
I think it was a process, yes, a process.
And how do you think it's affected your music making since?
It certainly made it more essential. I would more terse, partly because I can't work in the way that I can't write pieces that last 7 hours anymore. So it's much more concentrated, and I suppose more essential. Yes.
I'm going to introduce the idea of painting here for no particular reason, because I'm interested that so many painters get better as they're older, and I've always wondered why this is, and I wonder if there's a parallel here. It's just harder to make the marks, and therefore you don't want to waste effort. You therefore have to be looser, or in a sense more intense.
More intense. I think that probably is true.
Physical frailty can actually make you a more interesting artist, I wonder. Question.
Well,
wouldn't work for a novelist, I suspect.
Well, I think novelists are a bit strange breed. I wouldn't worry about them. But I think the odd thing about life is that it is so short. And it seems to me that the only way to lengthen it is to live for what you love and never give way to indifference. And if you are involved in creating any kind, of course, you're never indifferent, because the thing itself is always challenging you to be more, to do more. And it gives you this subtlety and flexibility and a way of being in the world, which I think other things don't provide.
John Drury, I just want to come back one more time to the Herbert story before we leave it, because what happened to England immediately after, well, very soon after Herbert's death, of course, was the Civil War and the kind of ripping apart of the fabric of the country. And he wrote a beautiful poem about the British Church, making the case for moderation. There's the Romans on one side and there's the Lutherans on the other, and we're in the middle. And again, I'd like to come back to the question of whether George Herbert is an essentially English voice in his unfashionable enthusiasm for the middle road, moderation.
It was, as said before, a very, very lucky period. He had an excellent patron who was an example of this, Bishop Williams, a man who's not talked about much, absolutely detested by William Laud, who became one of the causes of the Civil War with his
the naughty
extremism.
archbishop, yes.
Yes, he was quite immoderate. And Williams called him the little meddling hocus-pocus. Walton tries to introduce Laud into Herbert's life, but he certainly is wrong, and writing after the Restoration and forcing the pace. But moderation, yes, really mattered to Herbert because he was seeking it in his own soul and in his life.
It's so interesting. It's the last period of calm voices before the kind of shouting and the screaming from both sides become unavoidable and incandescent and lead to war.
Yes, exactly. A remarkable poem called Death, when his own death was approaching. And he talks to death as if death was a parishioner whom he's bumped into.
OK, let's have it, I think.
Shall we?
Yes, let's have it.
Because Herbert has a lot of humour and wit. It's a time, and perhaps this is particularly good, it's a time when religion is so much part of life that you can make jokes about it. So here it is, and it's as if he's come across this old chap in his parish rounds. Death. Thou wast once an uncouth, hideous thing, nothing but bones, the sad effect of sadder groans. Thy mouth was open, but thou couldst not sing. For we considered thee as at some 6 or 10 years hence, after the loss of life and sense, flesh being turned to dust and bones to sticks, we looked on this side of thee, shooting short, where we did find the shells of fled souls left behind, dry dust, which sheds no tears, but may extort. But since our Saviour's death did put some blood into thy face, thou art grown fair and full of grace, much in request, much sought for as a good. For we do now behold thee gay and glad, as at doomsday, when souls shall wear their new array, and all thy bones with beauty shall be clad. Therefore we can go die as sleep, and trust half that we have unto an honest, faithful grave, making our pillows either down or dust.
Jeanette, let me turn... You talked about novelists as being a weird tribe or a strange lot. What do you make of the argument that, of its nature, the novel is an anti-religious form, that it's got a personal story at its core which upends a lot of the sort of superstructure of art that went before it?
I don't think that's so. It's such a ragbag form anyway, and such a stretchy thing to play with, and it changes continually. But I think one of the things that fiction does is only really the sort of questions that Herbert was exploring about how you find your own voice. What's the difference between personal conviction and authority in the world? Is it your story or is it a public story? All of that navigation between, again, private lives and public worlds, which the novel is so good at, and how you deal with moral dilemmas, because no two situations are alike. So you can't simply have a template and say, I will always behave like this, which is something that I think the likes of Herbert is really struggling with on a conscience basis. How do I make my mind up when each situation presents itself afresh? Where am I in this as a moral being, rather than just saying, here are the rules and I will stick by them? So I think that this, in a way, all this period anticipates what we're going to find so much more strongly and stridently in fiction, in the novel, about the individual's place in society.
And he's very hard on himself. Would you say that a good writer has to be hard on themselves?
Oh, always. You can't be self-indulgent. And you always have to believe that either that something is wrong or something is missing, and always, of course, that you could have done it better. It's about answering to conscience, but it's also about keeping perpetually alive and not dying before you are dead. I mean, there are lots of people walking around now who are in fact dead, although they appear to be alive.
Because they're not conscious of being alive, the extraordinary lucky chance of being alive.
No, and I think what we're always, in creative work, it's always trying to keep us conscious and at a high level, so that this strange ragbag of being, this human being that appears to die, whether there's an afterlife or not, we don't know, but consciousness seems to be something that we all strive for.
Look around and pay attention, in short.
And I wish we could drag Michael Gove in here, really, and stop this whole utilitarian aspect of education.
We're going to drag him in soon, but not this week, I'm afraid. But...
And just say, let's have an education which is not about utility, but which is about allowing people to be human beings in all that glory and difficulty. Otherwise we're back with Engels, aren't we, looking around at the slums of Manchester and saying this is what happens when men regard each other only as useful objects. Something Herbert would have hated.
But in Herbert's world that would be completely incomprehensible. That was the one thing that people didn't regard each other as. It was sort of pre-market in that base. People had the dignity of what they did. They were farmers, or they were vicars, or they were soldiers, whatever they were.
I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, we are looking at the market, aren't we, and what's happened before the market and after the market. It becomes this golden calf in the wilderness where everyone has to buy and sell.
Maybe that's why we go back to people like Herbert and to the earlier religious composers, because we want to be rooted in a world where we had a different relationship with each other and with the year and the festivals and nature and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in a way, in Herbert's world, the world was poetry, i.e. it was symbolic. They were unconscious of a lot of this and thought it to be fact. For example, that stuff about death and Christ's own redeeming death and resurrection. All this is a sort of poetry about our life and our lives.
So they saw the world very, very differently. We can't even imagine that, I would have thought, now, after the Enlightenment and after all the things that have happened and after the effect of the market for so long.
I think we can, because I think Herbert is proto-Enlightenment and he goes by experience. Francis Bacon was a great friend of his. So you don't start with dogma or rules or laws or anything. You start with what has happened in your life and trying to construct sense of it, which means making poetry.
One of the things that comes out of Jeanette's memoir recently is the importance of praising, something that non-religious people don't have a place to go and do. And I was just wondering, Sir John, if part of the idea of your kind of serious music is getting people into a space where they can, praise the world around them, express joy. Because there aren't many places you can do that running through the average life.
And also there's a notable lack of joy in modern art, I would say. There's plenty of angst and human despair, but very little joy. It doesn't want to be a sort of easily won joy, but I remember my music master at Highgate, wife, always used to say, all great art should have a message of hope. And I think that's true. Somewhere, I think at the end of a deeply depressing Bergman film, there's always a message of hope. He certainly told me that was the case.
We've become very uneasy with the word beauty, I've noticed. I mean, critics flinch away from it as a kind of toxic thing. Victorian period, that's all they talked about. Now we don't talk about it at all. In fact, it's a sign of ignorance to raise the word.
Yes, and the director of the National Gallery, when he was teaching Nicholas Penny's, felt like holding things up in front of pupils and shouting at them, "This is beautiful."
But isn't there a misappreciation of the feminine? Hasn't that? I mean, an understanding of the feminine in Dante's period was something extraordinary, which we've completely lost today.
I think I need to ask you to expand on that.
Well, the idea of the eternal feminine, and that by a great love of a particular woman, you are brought in. To love a woman is also to love God. That was the case in Dante's great love for Beatrice. And I think the feminine dimension seems to have gone out of art.
I think people can move back towards it. I mean, if you think about, Tracey Emin's notorious artworks, and now she's moved into doing these really splendid blue nudes, which are line drawings, and it's as though she's come back to a certain piece, and they are beautiful. I'd love to have one, and that's completely new for Tracey to have done this. So I think we also have to trust both our own creativity and what's working within the zeitgeist, don't we, to find ways through the things that are lacking. And allow them somehow to flourish again, or at least to show signs of life.
So we've been talking about happiness, we've been talking a bit about beauty. What about where we started, which is the importance of being religious? I think Coleridge said, John Drury, that you couldn't understand Herbert if you weren't a Christian yourself. Yes,
I think he was completely wrong. And T.S. Eliot, luckily, slapped him down, said this wasn't the case, that this is about being a human being, about reaching maturity, about going through desolations and disappointments. That's the thing. And making out of that something that is both true to it and available to other people, with simplicity and skill. There's an extraordinary coming together.
So we have to remember what Sir John was talking about, the survival of spirituality in everybody, almost everybody, whatever happens to some of the organised forms.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet if you don't have the organised forms, if you don't have the organised structure of the sort of prayer forms and so forth that Herbert uses again, if you don't have the organised places of worship and the organised tradition of music, it's very, very hard to start all over again.
It is
you can't just recreate it.
And wouldn't you argue that the Church was a wise patron in the time of the Middle Ages, in the time of Tudor England, and is no longer that wise artistic patron?
Well, it's just not quite so big, and it hasn't got quite so much money to do it, so we can't be like the Renaissance popes.
No.
But the Church, until quite recently, and you're there, and quite a lot of your colleagues are there. Robin Holloway is writing for it. Of course, Britain wrote for it, Vaughan Williams and so on. So a bit early to say, isn't it? A bit early to throw wreaths.
I think forms are very helpful in so much as if you want to think freely and also take risks in your imagination.
You need some kind of constricting
form. Yeah, you do.
You
need some sorts of boundaries. They're helpful, even though the boundaries themselves are propositional, as everything is. We make it up as we go along, and that's when it hardens into dogma. Of course, it becomes very difficult because, we do invent these forms and then we forget that we've invented them and say it's always been done like this. And then, of course, people rebel and smash the thing up. It's the new wine in old bottles.
If you don't have
can't do
pentameters,
it.
you can't. There's lots of things you can't do if you don't use pentameters and you don't use particular rhyme
You need to
schemes and so on.
recognise the useful tools and shapes and things. These boundaries might be good for my life. At some point, they may not. They may become prison bars instead of something that contains and holds me. And that of course, is a higher dilemma when suddenly you have to smash up all that you've known and where you've been safe and risk it. And I think there's in the spiritual development, there's always that crisis, isn't there? There's a point where everything that's contained you has to be blown apart, and then you're left sort of naked and howling like a new babe to go forward without these shapes. But that's further on. I think to begin with, having shapes, definitions around you, structures, however arbitrary, just help your soul to grow.
Well, we started off by talking about a world in which people had eloquent conversation and could talk properly. I think you've just heard it's not entirely gone. Thank you very much to all of you. Jeanette Winterson, who's now looking forward to her retelling of The Winter's Tale next year. The world premiere of Sir John Tavener's 3 Shakespeare sonnets is being performed at Southwark Cathedral on Friday, and John Drury's biography of George Herbert, Music at Midnight, is out now in all good bookshops. Next week, Bridget Kendall is here to discuss the early years of Gandhi and Churchill with Ramachandra Guha and David Reynolds. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
By our greatest composer of religious music, Sir John Tavener, known for works such as The Protecting Veil and Song for Athene. Sir John nearly died several years ago and found the experience of the possibility of sudden death changed his outlook to music and faith. And with them, the writer whose ultra-religious evangelical upbringing in Lancashire has become the stuff of legend, and whose rebellion against it helped fuel a series of stunning novels and a heartbreaking memoir, Jeanette, Winterson. It's a conversation I think is going to shoot all over the place, but I'd like to start, if I may, John Drury, by just setting Herbert in context. This is really England between the great Shakespearean age and the coming revolutionary religious wars.
Yes, Herbert was lucky in the time in which he lived. James I, the most intelligent monarch, I should think, that has sat upon the throne.
He doesn't often get a good press. Interesting to hear you saying that.
Well, he wrote huge Latin works. I don't think they're particularly worth reading, but in their time they were very, very notable. And he promoted intelligent people wherever he could. Unfortunately, he was besotted with the Duke of Buckingham, and that's something which Herbert eventually confronted and which upset him a good deal. The oration that he gave when Buckingham came back from Spain, having made a complete fool of himself with Prince Charles, was a piece of really outrageous flattery and special pleading, after which his academic career as orator, as a Cambridge Don, petered out. Something happened. I guess something like, do I want to do this all my life?
And you make it clear in your book that this was an ambitious, worldly man. Yes. For a lot of his life. He tried quite hard to make a success of it.
He did. Indeed, to get the oratorship, he became practically obsessive and manic. He was writing letters all over the place and in a tremendous state. He wanted it really badly. Of course, that reflects on another advantage that he had, which was for a very intelligent boy to be trained in language, his own and Latin.
And the Cambridge education is a lot. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. In the 10 years to 2011, the number of people in this country who defined themselves as Christian dropped from 72% to 59%. Judged by church-going attendance, we are one of the most secular countries on the planet. And yet in a poll conducted for a Christian think tank, most people do believe in spiritual forces. That's the background for today's discussion, when I want to ask an apparently very simple question, but one appropriate for the time of year. If we are not a nation of great formal religious believers, why is it that religious poetry and religious music seem to matter more than ever? For me, it's a personal question, because since my stroke, I found myself, though I am not religious, turning to the poetry of Christian writers such as T.S. Eliot, Wendell Berry, and in particular, George Herbert. And the music I'm playing constantly is Bach cantatas. To talk about this, we have the Reverend John Drury, who has written a splendid new biography of George Herbert. He's joined, and then, of course, he has his great crisis, and he decides to become a country parson,
Yes.
and almost search for obscurity and the inner life. And I suppose what the most extraordinary thing about these poems is that they were never intended originally to be published. They weren't for a public. They were between him and God. They're more like prayers in some respects
Yes,
than conventional poems.
They're a sort of diary, I think. I mean, religion is very bewildering. The Christian religion can be very, very bewildering in its demands and notions and everything. And it was something he wrote to sort out himself in the presence of God. So, as you say, they're like prayers.
And he has this remarkably intimate tone, and I think we need to hear one at this point. You start off with the Love 3, I think, at the beginning of your book, which is one of the most...
That's an extraordinary one. It's difficult to read, but I better have the text.
I think you better have a go.
Yes, he always knew, in a way, that he would never do better than this, and yet he went on writing. It's not the last poem he wrote by any means, but it always at last in his collection.
It's about dialogue and learning how to respond to other arguments.
Yes, I think that's very important. Yes, an examination was something where you argued with somebody else, viva voce. It wasn't writing, it was speaking. As well as you've mentioned, he was there in the time of Shakespeare and Donne. He was also in the great age for English music, with Doland, Gibbons.
His mother was clearly a remarkable woman, a friend of John Donne's, and so he was brought up in a highly cultured, quite sophisticated environment.
Yes, he was. It was in many ways a stroke of luck because his father died and they moved from Montgomery, which was the Wild West, and his father's family were tough and sort of sheriffs in a soap opera, really, and they moved to near Shrewsbury, where his mother had her house, his widowed mother. Philip Sidney had stayed with them just south of Shrewsbury when he was a boy at the school there, and eventually to London and to Cambridge.